Start. Okay. Thank you for this good day and this good life we've been given. Indigenous cause Geti Canoe and Donjiba White Earth, Anishinaabe and Dow, Mokodoram and Dow, Menawa, Gordon Henry, and Shaganoshimo. I want to thank you all again to Unsettling Genealogies. This will be our final panel for this season. Maybe someone else will pick up on these panels at another time this summer. There's talk of that as well. We appreciate all the support we've gotten for these panels over the past 3 or 4 weeks. And we have another great panel slated for this afternoon. I will turn things over to my colleague, Liana Costatino, but I want to remind you that this is not a place where you seek out your ancestors. It's not a forum for genealogical exploration for people who want to know who their native ancestors are. And also the opinions and ideas expressed here by the panelists are not the opinions of Michigan State University, the governing body of Michigan State University, the administrators, faculty, or students. And again, we appreciate the support from everyone, and we'll get started now. Liana?
I think that Taylor has something to say first.
Thanks, everyone. I just want to remind everybody that this link that I just posted in the chat will take you to more information about the conference, but I'll also be where all of the recordings are hiding out. So you can visit there, as well as click a link to share your email address if you're interested in staying connected and involved with this issue. We will not share your contact information with anyone, but we will share with you upcoming events and opportunities to stay involved in order to stay connected to this issue. So feel free to check that out at that link. I see some requests for it, so let's see if this works. All right, there it is. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Taylor. Shionigad, Liana Costantino Dagwado. My name is Liana Costantino, and just a quick reminder as well that if you have questions for the presenters, please keep them relevant to their presentations and drop them in the Q&A section, not in the chat, preferably, and the questions will all be asked and answered at the very, very end here. All right, so our first presenter is Mr. Daryl Larue. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University in, oh, I'm gonna butcher this, I don't even wanna say it, Kipuktuk in Mi'kmaq Territory, Halifax, Nova Scotia. His book, Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous Identity, University of Manitoba Press in 2019, examines the rise of false claims to Indigenous identities by French Canadians since the mid-2000s. Welcome, Daryl. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. So I wanted to just take a moment to thank Gordon for putting on this, for having the vision really to put on this great event, this series, and also Taylor for helping out with the organizing. Obviously, it was a big endeavor, and I think we're here on the last day, and it's been really a great series. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to watching the sessions I wasn't able to attend. And today, we're going to sort of be in conversation. There's 4 of us, and we're going to be in conversation about the different sort of ways in which, whether we call it race shifting or self-indigenization, or whatever sort of concept we use, operates in different sort of settler colonial contexts in particular. And also just different national contexts. You'll see that not all of the contexts are settler colonial. So in particular, we'll be looking at the work that I do that's specific to French descendants or French Canadians, although some of them are in the US, as I'll get into a little bit. But also, so that's primarily in Canada, but a little bit in the United States. There's also going to be the example of the Sami in Finland and Aboriginal people in Australia in relation to this topic of self-indigenization, and also a critique of Chicanismo in the US Southwest in particular. So you'll see that there's some threads that we're going to pull that I think point to some of the parallels, some of the similar strategies that are used in these different sort of contexts, but also some different ones. And so we're hoping to be able to learn from each other in terms of building a more robust understanding of how this sort of movement, if you will, is operating in all kinds of different contexts. So yeah, my research is specific to what I call French descendants. French descendants, in my case, refers to those who are descended from the earliest French settlers who settled in primarily the St. Lawrence River Valley. So in what generally is referred to as Quebec today, but also in other parts of Eastern Canada, like where I live right now in Nova Scotia. There's what the people who became known as the Acadians also settled here. So my research is specific to them. I'm French Canadian, both my parents are. And so I, at some point, decided to study the specific dynamics of racism and colonialism among French descendants in Canada. And so this kind of just led me to this sort of emerging movement that came to my attention through different means, but really starting in 2014-15, I had already written about the role that genealogy in particular plays in French Canada. So for those who don't know, the genealogical sector in French Canada is among the most developed in the world for a particular national population. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. I could talk more about it later if you will, but this movement largely relies on those genealogical records, the historical documents, what I found out in doing this research is that the large majority of French Canadians have a small amount of Indigenous ancestry. So there are about 13 to 14 million French descendants in Canada today, and about 3 to 4 million in the United States. How did they get into the United States? Basically through immigration in the 1800s in particular, primarily in New England. So from 1850 to about 1910, 500,000 French Canadians, or people from Quebec, immigrated into New England. And then another 100,000 or so ended up in the US Midwest. So that population today, almost 20 million, but not quite. If we look at it, about 75% have a small amount of Indigenous ancestry in the 1600s. Usually from the beginning of the colony, there are 13 Indigenous women who marry Frenchmen from about 1610 to 1670. And so because the French Canadian the French population in what they call New France was very tiny compared to the population in New England and also further south of the Virginia colony. So what happens is it's what's called a founder effect. And so that means because of the history of intermarriage, essentially for generations, 10 to 12 generations, French Canadians, not exclusively, but almost exclusively intermarried with each other. And that has meant that we all have the same sort of group of ancestors, more or less from the very early colonial period. So for instance, I have 3 Algonquin women ancestors. The Algonquin are Anishinaabe people, the Ottawa River Valley. 3 Algonquin ancestors who were all born before 1650, and that's not unusual. So I explained in my book that that's more or less what one would expect from French Canadian genealogy today. So if we look at just in Canada, the number of people who have that ancestry, but who are white French Canadians, we're talking about 10 million people. Right? In the US, it would be another 2 to 3 million people. Now, obviously, the large majority of those individuals are not claiming that they're Indigenous based on that ancestry, but a growing number are. So in terms of my research, it's anywhere from 250 to 400,000 people. It really depends how we're defining that. I follow census returns over from the 90s to the present, essentially. You can see a big shift in people who are identifying as Métis, quote unquote, or mixed Indigenous. You also see a number of other people who more recently are claiming to be what we call in Canada First Nations people. So they'll say that they're Anishinaabe, they'll say that they're Mi'kmaq, they'll say that they're Abenaki, and they're not. There's also a large amount of organizations. So there are about 6 organizations in the 3 main eastern provinces in Canada that accept members based mostly on self-identification. Sometimes there's a genealogical verification, but anyone with any ancestry basically gets in, including about, in my research, about 30% of members who don't have an Indigenous ancestor, which we would expect to find among French descendants, but who made one up. So in my research, I look at how there's a whole series of French women who are turned into Indigenous women so that those who don't find an actual Indigenous ancestor can say they have one. And then they join these organizations. And so this movement has, it looks different depending on which region. And as an example, we see that there are these quote unquote tribes in Vermont and New Hampshire. There's 4 of these so-called Abenaki tribes in Vermont that are state recognized as of 2011, 2012. And they're French Canadians. They're the descendants of French Canadians who moved to Vermont in the mid 1800s as part of that wave of immigration into New England that I was talking about earlier. Actually, people went to Vermont earliest in New England. So I just wrote a paper on this whole process, and I know this because they submitted their primary root ancestor families in a series of documents that they presented to the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, for federal recognition. And so just kind of looked into those families, and they're all French Canadian. Actually, they're not all. There's 15 of them. 2 of them are German American, and then 1 is English American. The rest are all from Canada, and they're all French Canadian. So those 4 quote unquote tribes have managed to actually mobilize the state in their favor over a number of years. And they inter human remains. They access federal and state educational funds. And they generally are treated as Native Americans in Vermont in particular, when in fact they aren't at all. So there's an event actually happening. I'll put a link in the conversation here or in the chat at the University of Vermont, just actually on April 29th, so not too far away, that you can sign up for. And it's the people, the Abenaki people who live on a reserve. In the US, you call them reservations, but in Canada, not far from the Vermont border, called Odanak. And so a whole crew of people from Odanak are traveling to the University of Vermont for the first time to speak out about this movement in Vermont and their opposition to it. So that's really going to be an important event when it comes to sort of regional politics, and particularly this whole question of self-indigenization and race shifting. So I think maybe I have another minute, and I'm more than happy to get into some of the details of my work, if you will. The first part of my book is where I look at the mechanisms of race shifting. So I look at how people indigenize themselves, which ancestors they use in which ways. And so that's kind of my effort to sort of give us some language to try to really be able to name what's happening out there. And then the second part is an analysis of these 2 organizations that are led by white men who are hunters, who are upset about different land claims happening in 2 regions in Quebec. And they just decide that the best political strategy that they can adopt to oppose First Nations, Indigenous people in those territories is to indigenize themselves. So it's a very self-conscious political strategy by people who are actually quite anti-Indigenous in their politics. And so that's kind of the case study that I look at in the second part of my book. So yeah, I think maybe I'll just leave it at that, and welcome, any sort of comments and questions. And I think we'll be able to sort of pull some of those threads about the particularities in different national contexts. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Daryl, for that. Much appreciated. Next up, we have Victoria Grieve-Williams. She is a historian working in interdisciplinary ways to progress Indigenous knowledge in the academy. Her research and interests include Aboriginal spirituality and philosophy, race, sexuality, activism, and approaches to decolonization. Victoria seeks to make the phenomenon of Indigenous identity fraud in Australia a viable and accepted area of research. Currently a resident in New York State, USA, she is an adjunct professor at the RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome, Victoria.
Am I in view yet?
Not
My
yet.
bad. Oh, okay.
Can you find your camera to turn it on?
It tells me I'm unable. Oh,
Ah.
okay. Now I can.
Oh, there we go.
Well, it just said the host had stopped it, but I'm there. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And as you said, my name's Victoria Grieve-Williams. I'm very honoured to be invited to speak to you today. And I want to thank Gordon Henry, the Leslie Chair, for his kind invitation to speak at this conference. I am a Warramai person from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, Australia. And as you can see, I'm obviously of mixed race, as are the greater proportion of Aboriginal people living in Australia today. In my case, I have two Aboriginal grandmothers, one of whom is Warramai, from a very large family and kinship network of less than 2,000 people. This is large for us, at least. I say this because Warramai people were absolutely decimated by the early colonial contact in the 1820s, which was mainly the activity of the Australian Agricultural Company. So we were colonised by an early corporate identity that is a little unusual in Australia. The records are hard to access, but we understand that they brought their own militia. A lot of them had been in India and they brought sepoys with them. And we do have some people in Warramai who are also descended from people from South Asia. So the aftermath of this violent theft of our lands was approximately 14 family formations, of which only one had an Aboriginal male head. So the colonial experience in Australia is often referred to as a gendered conquest because this pattern was repeated across the country. And you might like to reflect too that Australia was colonised after North America and Canada, though probably still being colonised at the time of the Great Plains and so on in the West. And the British and later American settler governments learnt from their experience. So it seems that in Australia, it was a much more final solution, if you like, to what had happened in North America and Canada. So as for Warramai, we're a matrilineal people, and this is my principal source of cultural knowledge. My mother worked on sheep stations inland, but we visited my grandparents for months at a time. So I was fortunate to experience the very disciplined life in my grandparents' home, the working together life, going out onto country to fish and gather food, and learning to fish with all that involves in skill and knowledge, but most of all, knowing my place, learning how to listen. My other grandmother said she was from Tasmania, but we know very little of her. I did not meet my father until I was in my 30s, so it's still something that I would like to know more about. I was very interested to listen to the introduction by George Cornell from the Sault Ste. Marie Chippewa people. If you're there, I'd like to thank you for putting the development of Indigenous identity fraud in the context of developments in higher education at your university and elsewhere in the USA. This had me reflect on my own experience in the Australian context that is somewhat parallel to yours, but occurred in the 1980s. My first experience of working with Aboriginal people was in an inner city suburb called Redfern in Sydney. And Aboriginal people tended to cluster there from the 60s, after opportunities to live there had been quietly opened up by Aboriginal people who travelled there to work in factories from the 1920s and 30s. It would have been Jewish and other migrant factory owners that were inclusive of Aboriginal workers at that time. I was a recent graduate in the 1980s, enrolled in a grad dip ed so that I could go back to my home community and teach high school as I'd been asked to do. That never eventuated. What I want to say to you about my experience in Redfern was that I was unknown, a newcomer, and I was pretty much consistently questioned as to my Aboriginal bona fides. As it happened, my mother's second cousin, who knew more about my family relationships than I, vouched for me. He was an Aboriginal education worker at a local school, and he asked to meet me. We spent hours. I learnt so much, and I remembered his mother visiting my grandmother. Danny Slater was one of those solid community people very much missed. And I'd like to take the time to mention other Worimi people who have shaped me. Patricia David Hurst, May Simon, Ilma Simon, Ellie Dumas, and Norma Fisher. We have a protocol that when we meet another Aboriginal person, we ask who they are. Where are they from? It is a way of relating that leads into a real conversation, establishing connections. That is how it used to be. At one point in my career, I worked for the Commonwealth Government in developing a national Aboriginal education policy. Settler public servants would be most impatient with me when visiting communities. In their minds, it was a waste of time. I knew it was the only way to do productive business. Now the Aboriginal identity frauds are also impatient with this protocol. They cannot respond, and so their reaction is to call the protocol lateral violence. By asking the question, you are questioning identity, and this is offensive. And if one is offended, then you are right by default. We can go no further. It seems to paralyze the whole situation. It was in the National Capital and doing this work in the early 1990s that I first became aware of identity fraud. A woman who was the go-to Aboriginal person at one of our major institutions was causing great concern amongst the local Aboriginal community. My Aboriginal friends told me, and I had to admit, that she was unconnected, that is, no living relations, often inappropriate and brazen about Aboriginal knowledge in ways that we're not. A prominent Aboriginal artist and academic challenged her appointment. I know little of the process, if any, that was employed, but that particular woman is still there today. This was the beginning of what I have observed as a tsunami of settlers identifying as Aboriginal. You may not realise this, but the Tasmanian people who were rumoured to be extinct are alive and well and still mounting perhaps the most fierce resistance in Australia. They've been calling the fraudsters box tickers for at least 2 decades. They tick the box on the census, on applications for university entrance and housing, amongst other things. They swamped the Office of ATSIC with applications for everything possible in the 1990s, and it was estimated that as many as 13,000 people were newly identifying Aboriginal people at that time. Housing was the big letter item, followed by education. Tasmanian Aboriginal people have negotiated a truth-telling commission with the Tasmanian government that is likely to also deal with this issue, truth in identity. Watch this space. In the first decade of this century, Aboriginal elders in New South Wales, Marjorie Woodrow, Les Ridgway and Nolene Briggs, went public with this issue and had a moment in the media, just a moment. All of their representations to governments and institutions fell on deaf ears. This has not changed. Arguably, it's worse. We know that having an ancestor is not enough. A person needs to be living an Aboriginal life of connection to living Aboriginal relations and kin in order to be truly an Aboriginal person. But now people are no longer having to find an ancestor. They can just believe there is one. And Australia is not as white in a way as some people might think. There were 11 Africans on the First Fleet, and African men in particular sailors jumped ship. Some of them married into our families. There are a couple of, well-known Aboriginal families that are also of African descent, but quite a number married into the white community. So if people think, well, that old lady, the great-grandmother or something was kind of dark, then they want to assume this is an Aboriginal ancestor. So without any proof. So also people, it sounds crazy, but they dream about it, or they have a feeling about it. And universities in particular only require a statutory declaration to say that you believe you are an Aboriginal person for special Aboriginal entry. This leads to the question of why it is that settler colonial governments and institutions stand back and allow this to happen. Why is it that they ignore the representations of Aboriginal people to have something done about it, or to empower Aboriginal people to be able to do something about it? It's a really interesting question, because arguably the more people who are identifying as Aboriginal means more government money is spent. And there's a huge health initiative in Australia called Closing the Gap, where you don't have to go to an Aboriginal medical service. You can go to a general practice and have all of your health needs met, and extras on top, like mental health counselling you might never think to have, for no cost at all. So it's a huge burden on governments, arguably. Why would they do this? Maybe it's because there's been international scrutiny on Australia through the United Nations since the 1950s. It's very interesting to look at the history, but African countries in particular started to put more scrutiny on Australia because of Australia's support for the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so Australia's become particularly sensitive to this kind of scrutiny. So when you let settlers in to be Aboriginal, the statistics improve. The statistics about infant mortality, the statistics to do with education, to do with all kinds of health, the life expectancy. Life expectancy for Aboriginal men has been as low as 38 in the last 3 decades. But of course, that's all improved. But what is the cost to Aboriginal people of this? I've argued in a paper that I gave at the Canadian Anthropology Conference last year that the cost is immense. I've got a series of interviews, and I'm still doing them, with Aboriginal people across the country. When people hear that I'm doing this, they put up their hand, they want to be interviewed because there's so much concern about what's happening with the identity fraud. The interviews are revealing that there's a huge amount of anxiety and people's health is suffering. They're further dispossessed. They have huge problems with identity fraud in something like native title. And the native title anthropologists and lawyers take what the identity fraud people say at face value. We've got all these new groups of Aboriginal people that are springing up that's absolutely causing huge distress to Aboriginal people. It's a homogenizing of Aboriginal people. It's a normalizing of our history into something that has been almost benign and very palatable to settler colonials. How much time have I got left? I estimate I've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes.
I think 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So what I want to do is just briefly to put this into a bigger framework. I think this is the thing that Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous views of what's going on really gives us, is the opportunity for the big, big picture. And, I think what Indigenous people around the world have suffered is the criminal takeover of their lands and resources is a result of the overpopulation of the earth. We often talk about the pull factors, they came because there was land. We don't talk about the push. Settlers came from extraordinarily disadvantaged, if you like, particularly in Australia, the rotting hulks on the Thames and the convicts and so on and so forth. And I've read quite a bit recently about what happened, the violent dispossession of some native groups in North America. It's a very similar story. These people the settlers had lost their connection to the natural world. And here we are, we're the vestiges of people who still have that connection, who value it, and who want to progress it. I think that what's happened is the settler colonial governments have forced Indigenous people into what I call a state of exception. It's certainly the case in Australia, and I've written about this. I've used Agamben's idea of the state of exception, whereas people who are in that predicament, if you like, have no power whatsoever. And in fact, they can be killed by any citizen. People in the state of exception do not have citizenship rights. They're outside of that. They're homo sacer, the idea of the person who's wandering by the city limits and who can be killed with impunity. This is what happens in Aboriginal Australia. Aboriginal people are killed with impunity. I could give you so many examples, but Aboriginal men have been kicked to death, and the people who did this got maybe 2 years jail. And the Aboriginal women's story is another one. What I want to say is that this is another aspect to me of this state of exception, that settler colonials are the ones who are able to get the benefits that come from being a disadvantaged group. Aboriginal people as a disadvantaged group in Australia are in a state of exception. They cannot get these benefits, right? And so, the frustrations of government that nothing works up until the 1990s. And guess what's happened? Settler colonials step into the breach. They get the advantages and and everything seems to improve on paper. They are actually taking our place. They are taking our place. It is the most complete genocide. And just to finish, it's important that Indigenous people survive, because at some point this world is going to need to be put back together again. We know about the collapse. We know about the huge environmental calamities, and a lot of us know about the shocks that are yet coming. It is going to be Indigenous people who will be able to remember, in the words of Akili Mbembe, this really wonderful concept of remembering the earth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was powerful. Appreciate it. Our next speaker is Ricardo Signs of the Comanche Nation. Ricardo graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a master's in Indigenous Peoples Law. He was a panelist on a 2021 NASA panel about race shifting within Chicanismo called The Recent Settler Turn to Indigeneity, Indigenous Self-Determination, and the Challenge of Race Shifting, and has been speaking about the settler colonial characteristics within Mexican and Chicano nationalism for over 15 years. Welcome, Ricardo.
Thank you, Liana. Okay, so I'm going to talk about race shifting within Chicanismo. In order to understand, we have to go back to the time of Spanish colonization of Mexico, where there was a racial caste system, where the Spanish were on top, Indigenous, Asians, and Black people were below. Eventually, there were like over 20 different types of caste systems that were created from these mixes But after Mexico became independent in 1810, the caste system didn't just go away, it was transformed. During this time, the ideology of mestizaje came into being, and there were two versions of mestizaje. The first one was white mestizophilia, which was involved the whitening of your caste. And the second one was Moreno mestizophilia, which was aimed at assimilating indigenous peoples into mestizaje. However, mestizos didn't treat indigenous peoples as equals, as they weren't able to obtain citizenship until they were deemed to be modernized. To learn more about this time period, I recommend reading Before Mestizaje by Ben Miss III and Mestizo Genomics by Peter Wade. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution happened, and there were new revolutionary Mexican intellectuals that created the modern day Mexican nationalism. They also tried to find a solution to Mexico's Indian problem. Their efforts led to the ideologies and policies of indigenismo. According to Lourdes Alberto, indigenismo is a range of governmental policies, educational reforms, land distributions, artistic movements, intellectual movements, and racial frameworks. Indigenismo has led to indigenous people being fetishized, but at the same time dismissing their voices while trying to forcefully assimilate them and modernize them. One product of indigenismo is the indigenous myth of origin that served Mexican nationalism. So at the same time, mestizaje continued to transform, using the indigenous myth of origin to promote the Spanish indigenous duality form of mestizaje, while at the same time rejecting Blackness and Black history of Mexico. So with mestizaje and indigenismo combined, it created a race-shifting narrative that served nationalistic purposes. I recommend reading Indian Nation in Revolutionary Mexico by Alexander S. Dawson. So these early Mexican intellectuals, nationalists, were essentially supporters of eugenics. They wanted to breed the best traits from each so-called race. Jose Vasconcelos was a promoter of this type of ideology, especially in his book, La Raza Cósmica, where he stated his vision of a new fifth race made out of the unification of existing racial groups in Mexico. He argued that the Spanish colonized indigenous peoples from a place of love. He also eventually became a supporter of Nazi ideology. Vasconcelos was the Minister of Education in Mexico from 1921-24, which he also supported the muralist movement. It was an artistic element of indigenismo, where many people have heard of Diego Rivera or Frida Kahlo. They were Mexican artists that played a key part in spreading indigenismo in Mexico to the masses with art. Kahlo herself has been accused of misappropriating indigenous cultures and aesthetics by indigenous peoples in Mexico. I want to emphasize that Mexican nationalism is a settler colonial construct, very similar to the US. But unlike US nationalism, race shifting is essential to the existence of Mexican nationalism. It is what Tuck and Yang have called settler move to innocence. Contemporary Mexican nationalism assimilates indigenous peoples into modern Mexican society as a way to absolve Mexican society from the ongoing violence, state violence aimed at indigenous peoples, rather than opening up avenues towards sovereignty and self-determination. And Chicanismo is a branch of Mexican nationalism. So I have to talk about what is Chicanismo. And during my time, I came up with, there's 3 explanations that Chicanos themselves have explained what is Chicanismo. The first one is, it's an experience. It's the children of Mexican immigrants in the US. It's a diaspora experience. Anybody can have this experience from Mexico, indigenous or non-indigenous. So that can give you indigeneity. The second one is an ethnicity. Non-indigenous can claim to be Chicanos. There's currently infighting among Chicanos of whether Central Americans or South Americans can claim to be Chicanos. The third one is a political ideology based on a diaspora experience or experience of American capitalism or experience of American settler colonization. This ideology alone cannot give somebody indigeneity. I want to clarify that there are some indigenous peoples from Mexico that claim to be Chicano in the US to describe their experiences of diaspora. I'm not speaking about them. There's conversation if they should even call themselves Chicanos. During my time in California and Texas, I had close-up opportunity to examine the Chicano movements, and I'm going to list some of the main claims of indigeneity by Chicanos. The first one is Aztlan. Chicanos claim that the land lost during the Mexican-American War is still theirs, and they call it Aztlan. Chicanos like to say the phrase, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," and cite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, which was made between two colonial powers. Chicanos claim that the taking of the land has transformed them into indigenous peoples because the US is now colonizing them. They also use Marxism, which we don't have enough time to cover that. The next one is Danza Azteca, which is it's like a dance routine, but it's also a political movement created in the 70s to assimilate all Mexicans into Neo-Aztec Mexican nationalism, including the learning the Nahuatl language. Early danzantes called this Neo-Aztec assimilation conquista or reconquista, which means reconquering, and called for the reconquering of Aztlan. They took elements of indigenous cultures from random communities, claiming them as their own, or bringing indigenous peoples into danza groups and calling their culture as their own. This is in Dancing Across Borders, Danzas y Bailes Mexicanos. I also counted this in person when I interviewed Chicanos. There's phenotypes. They claim indigeneity through phenotypes, and it goes something like, "I'm indigenous because I'm brown," even though they have no ties to any indigenous community, or they mine for indigenous ancestor in Spanish records, even though they have no current ties to any indigenous community. There's locational descent, is like, and it goes something like this: "My family's from Michoacan, so I must be Purepecha," even though they have no ties to indigenous communities. There's ancestry DNA tests. I don't think I have to explain that. People have read Kim Tallberg's work. There's also befriending indigenous peoples, using them to spread pro-indigenismo propaganda and to attack indigenous peoples that speak out against race shifting. I've seen people say that having the members of AIM write letters saying they believe Chicanos are indigenous or claiming to be adopted by Native people, they claim that culture as their own. Or there's also creating a fake tribe, which I've been asked many times: can Chicanos create a new Chicano tribe and have the US government recognize us? No. So there's two phrases that I want to talk about that Chicanos do use, but it's also used throughout the US by other race shifters, not necessarily just Chicano race shifters. The first one is detribalized, and they'll say something like this: "I don't belong to any indigenous community. I think I'm indigenous. I'm detribalized." These people claim to be detribalized as part of their indigenous experience and blame Spanish colonization and mestizaje for them not having connection to any community, Native community. But I believe they don't understand or know the history of mestizaje or indigenismo or how it's being used by race shifters. I do want to bring an example. In 2019, the Chicano Studies Department at UC Davis opened up an art exhibit called Chicanese Futurism at the Manetti Shore Museum. They had sacred indigenous objects on display, such as a sweat lodge and eagle feathers. Indigenous students and local indigenous leaders spoke out against this appropriation of these objects. The Chicano Studies Department likely broke federal laws regarding eagle feathers, but claimed they didn't break any laws because they were detribalized. There are cultural protocols within every indigenous community. It seems they wanted to have access to indigenous cultures without being part of any community. This is ignorance and disrespect to our cultures. In my opinion, they have a pan-indigenous understanding of our cultures. The next term is reconnecting. It's also used, by many types of race shifters without any ties to any indigenous community. But in the age of the internet, it's been picked up by indigenous peoples as well. I once was told, "How can you criticize Chicanismo when you're a reconnecting Native?" I had to take a step back. This is my analysis. Aren't all natives connecting in some way? We already have a term for our diaspora from our communities, and that term is urban Indian. So that term reconnecting is used two different ways, in my opinion, by Chicanos. It's so people that are race shifters can enter indigenous spaces with an ambiguous term that won't be questioned. And the second way is, at the same time, they use it on natives that might be insecure about not knowing their cultural language to not question their race shifting. So in my opinion, it's a weird blood quantum style measurement. At what point can a native say, "I'm no longer reconnecting, I am connected"? This is not a new critique of Chicano and Mexican nationalism or its tactics of race shifting. Indigenous peoples from Mexico have been saying this for decades. The issue for many of us who are critical of Chicanismo as it relates to indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, or indigeneity is that Chicano studies has been institutionalized throughout the US to such an extent that often our critiques are ignored before they're heard. If an indigenous person hasn't gone to college, the field will dismiss their concern. If they did, they will ask for a mountain of citation in order for them to consider listening to our critiques. It's elitist. None of the Chicano claims to indigeneity are to connections of any indigenous community. They're all to mental gymnastics. Chicanos are aggressive towards indigenous peoples that speak about race shifting. We get harassed, dogged, slandered, and death threats. I think there's a lack of conversation about sovereignty within, just in Mexico or even Chicano community. Chicanos have critiques of indigenous sovereignty, but I think they're made out of ignorance. They call our sovereignty colonial and associated with blood quantum. In my opinion, these talking points are heard by indigenous peoples in Mexico and has led to the hesitancy about having a real good conversation about sovereignty and its potential in Mexico. Misconceptions go both ways from the US and Mexican indigenous struggles, but I believe conversations between our two people can build bridges. Chicanos use the Mexico-US divide to sow further division between US and Mexican indigenous peoples by calling US natives xenophobic when we try to stand up against indigenismo. I believe there's a new wave of indigenismo that's being spread on the internet. Mexican and Chicano race shifters are monetarily profiting from pretending to be native, selling native items, selling online classes, giving political commentary under the guise of having an indigenous perspective. I'm not trying to copy and paste or stop sovereignty as a solution, only build conversation. Because I believe that sovereignty and building indigenous governments is important for us to be able to say who and who isn't indigenous. If not, the Mexican government will continue to move to innocence by assimilating indigenous peoples. I do have a minute left. So I do want to say that it's really important to understand how institutionalized this ideology is. It's not just race shifting as an individual. It's race shifting like in a mass movement that's supported by the state, which is really dangerous. So not just for Mexicans, but also for Native people in the US. Yeah, thank you. I'm good.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Appreciate that. And next we have Laura Junka-Aikio. She is Finnish. She is a Marie Sklodowska Curie Fellow at the Arctic University Museum of Norway and project leader for the Research Council of Norway-funded research project New Sami Renaissance, Nordic Colonialism, Social Change, and Indigenous Cultural Policy. Junka-Aikio's research focuses especially on political self-indigenization in Finland and on its impact on Sami self-determination. Her recent publications include a co-edited volume with a couple of other people, Sami Research in Transition, Knowledge, Politics, and Social Change. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference, which I think is truly historical, because in the way I see it is that this is actually a phenomenon that is very, very much transnational in terms of very similar discourses and very similar struggles emerging in a way as a backlash towards strengthening of indigenous rights all over the world. And I think we are only now sort of starting to catch up in terms of academic analysis of this phenomenon, which is also important for being able to criticize it and to oppose and challenge these movements and their impact on indigenous self-determination, especially. So I'm really honored to be here. And I have to say that after listening to the previous talks, the same as happens every time I talk with these people or hear other people talking about race shifting in different contexts, is that you find so many similarities, similar discourses, similar things, that it's quite that there could be this kind of conversation going on forever. So I have to limit my talk here to the things that I have planned, but I do hope that that I don't speak too long so that we have time for a good discussion. So basically, I will be talking here about how race shifting or self-indigenization, as I prefer to use the term, is articulated in the context of the Sami in Finland. And I have to emphasize that I'm really talking about the Finnish context, because the Sami, even though they are one people in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia, in each country there is different legal framework, different history of settlement, differences in cultural differences between the majority society and the Sami society, etc. So the issue of identity doesn't necessarily, or the politics of identity doesn't necessarily articulate in exactly the same ways in each country. So what I talk about here is really the politics of race shifting or self-indigenization in Finland. Before I start, I want to quickly just locate myself a bit more clearly. So I really am a Finnish scholar. I'm from Helsinki, and I'm not Sami at all. But due to personal relations, basically marriage and friendships and all things that follow, I've been following Sami politics for quite a long time. And I also have to say that in terms of transparency, that my father-in-law actually was for a long time the president of Sami parliament in Finland. And also my husband actually works in Sami parliament's election committee at the moment. So you can imagine that both the fact that I'm not a Sami and that I'm too close to the Sami have been used to undermine my research on this issue, which is an issue that you often get all kinds of efforts to undermine when you start working with this, because it is so politicized and because there is so much opposition for any critical takes on race shifting and self-indigenization. And what I also want to say quickly is that I think this topic, on the other hand, is something that really is important that also we non-Indigenous people actually look at, because I consider this as a major example of the politics of distraction. And for example, the Sami research community in Finland is very small and in many ways quite fragile. And I do think that there is topics for research that are important, that Sami who actually have a good knowledge of their culture can actually focus on those. So I think it's important that there are also allies who understand the problematic and who try to work on it, so that people in the Sami community have a chance to focus on other things also. Having said that, there are of course Sami people working on this issue in Finland. So basically in Finland, self-indigenization has become really one of the, or maybe the most central issue or challenge for Sami development of Sami rights and Sami self-determination. And it's very striking that the genealogy of these movements that exist now in Finland is very similar to what Darryl Leroux describes in his book, which was a revelation for me to read for this reason. And basically currently in Finland, there's various different movements and organizations which are claiming Sami or indigenous identity under various different labels. And what all these movements share is that they demand legal recognition as indigenous and as Sami. And the way this recognition is sort of, or the focus of this demand is that they want to be included in the electoral register of the Sami parliament, which is the institution of which formally represents the Sami in Finland and which implements Sami cultural autonomy. And the origins of these movements, or the genealogy of these movements, goes back to the mid-1990s, when in Finland laws that would result in the establishment of Sami cultural autonomy and in the establishment of the Sami parliament were being discussed and then passed. And at the time in the early 1990s, the efforts to strengthen Sami rights really resulted in strong opposition among many Finnish communities in northern Finland, which feared that this empowerment of the Sami, and especially the prospect of Sami land rights, would result in loss of or hamper their own access to land and resources. And so there was strong opposition against this cultural autonomy. But when these laws actually passed, these same groups changed strategy and started to claim that they are also Sami and they should also be included in Sami Parliament's electoral register, which became seen as a kind of a ticket to the possible rights, because there's no like a ethnic registry about the Sami in Finland. So basically this electoral register became seen as a formal recognition of indigeneity, and therefore if indigenous peoples are to get some special rights, so if you are part of this electoral register, then maybe you will get those rights as well. So this was one reason. And of course, the other reason was that by entering the Sami parliament, you can actually influence its policies from within. So there was this kind of movement emerging as the strategy shifted. And as a result, people started to look for ancestry records to find Sami ancestors so that they could also claim that they are Sami. And the problem in Finland is that, well, first of all, as in other contexts of race shifting, usually these ancestors are looked very far from generations that actually have no relevance for contemporary identity. So we are looking at people searching for ancestors from the late 17th, mostly 18th century and early 19th century. And of course, from the perspective of Sami, a proof of ancestor that kind of stands alone and does not involve also lived connection to the Sami society does not make somebody Sami. And secondly, also one problem is that the records that people look at were actually never made as ethnic records because they related to livelihoods. So their value as proof of your ancestors' ethnicity is very unreliable. And therefore, all these ancestry records, they kind of cannot be considered as a solid proof of ethnicity. So there are all kind of problems with this. And of course, the biggest problem is that these people who have been then trying to gain access to the electoral register are actually considered by the Sami as Finns. And before this new kind of tribe to become indigenous, also they themselves considered themselves as Finns. So there has been like a clear ethnic boundary between the Finns and the Sami, even though in Finland it's not racial in the same ways that it would be, for example, in Canada, where the settlers clearly came from a different continent. So, these movements then have proliferated over time. And one important thing or change that has happened is also that over time, these organizations have kind of benefited a lot from and focused on production of academic knowledge. So that's another interesting comparison, especially with the situation in Canada, that there has been a strong movement to produce knowledge which supports self-indigenization. And in Finland, first this movement or this academic knowledge production focused mostly on proving claims to looking at history and claims to land rights. But since 2010 onwards, this academic knowledge production has increasingly engaged sort of language of decolonization, indigenous revitalization, and it has produced concepts such as non-status Sami, which has no legal or historical grounding in Finland. So it was basically just snatched from the Canadian framework and then implemented in Finland. And basically the non-status Sami concept means anybody who has ancestor. It's not defined how far it is or how you prove the ancestor. Anybody who has any ancestor who is Sami is a non-status Sami if he is not or she is not included in the electoral register. So there's been this kind of knowledge production which has been supporting the movement. And over time, it has become also increasingly varied. So I think nowadays the motivations of people who are claiming themselves Sami or indigenous under some other ethnonyms that have emerged, many of them might be moved by some personal desire to feel more indigenous or feel more meaningful in many ways, in similar ways that what Cersei Sturm has been studying in her book. So I think nowadays it would be too simplifying to say that all of these people are really looking for land rights. It's very varied. But the problem is that these different organizations, different people, they are all very much allied and they all still share the demand that they want to be included in Sami Parliament's electoral register. And so what I think is important, I want to focus here, I'm not sure how much I have time, but first of all, as I said, I'm using the concept of self-indigenization. I think that's very important for me to kind of apply these concepts, a race-shifting concept, even though I love the concept as such, but it's not really working very well in the Finnish context. And then another aspect that I think is important is that I feel it's very important to talk about political self-indigenization in the context of the movements that I have just described and which also happen in other places where self-indigenization is not a matter of individuals trying to advance in their careers, etc., but where they are constituted as political movements and organizations which have a clear political agenda. And while I think all race shifting, all self-indigenization is of course in some ways political, I think it's important to recognize that especially this kind of organizations which have a clear political agenda and legal claims, they pose a particular kind of threat or challenge to indigenous self-determination. And it's important that as scholars, we can start to sort of differentiate different aspects of self-indigenization because it will be helpful to understand the different dimensions and not to lump everybody sort of within the same box. So in Finland, we're definitely talking about political self-indigenization. And it's been very influential in Finland. So actually since 2011, and especially after this academic knowledge production started to employ these concepts and discourses that sort of ally the self-indigenization movement with decolonization and revitalization and this kind of rhetoric, it's been very effective. And in Finland, one big problem is that the Sami parliament does not have the final word on the decisions who are included in the electoral register. So basically the Sami parliament and its election committee make the decisions, but then people have a chance to complain to the Finnish Supreme Administrative Court, which makes the final decision. And so people have been complaining to the Supreme Court, which has no Sami representatives. It's like all Finnish court. And so since 2011, the court has actually started to increasingly accept these people and forced the Sami parliament to take within its electoral register people that it considers as Finns, and which actually, according to the Act on Sami Parliament, should also be considered as Finns. And so there has been complaints to the United Nations about this and how the Finnish court is sort of forcibly assimilating the Sami in this way. And actually the United Nations in 2019 made a statement in which it stated that the Finnish state is actually guilty of assimilating the Sami and that it has to make a full remedy of these of the harm that these decisions have resulted in. And as a result of this, there is now effort by the state to actually revise and change the Act on Sami Parliament so that this kind of violations would not happen anymore. But there's a lot of political opposition, obviously, to this amendment of the Act on Sami Parliament. So this is where we are at the moment with the struggle. So there's effort to change the law so that it would protect better the Sami against this. But the political pressure from these movements is very, very strong. So it will be interesting to see if this improvement will happen. I think I will leave it here. I don't think I said all I wanted to say, but I do think we will be able to return to it in the questions. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you. And we have a couple of questions that actually two questions that I'm going to put into one from Anthony Lopez, who asks, what are the equivalents in the United States to Canada's Métis? And I'm going to invite all of our panelists to put their cameras on at this point. And if we give people a minute to kind of digest things, then the questions often will begin to come in. But just we'll start with this one. So what are the equivalents in the US to Canada's Métis? And is it the Chicanos who live upon the Spanish land grants that predate the USA? Are they the Métis of the United States?
I guess I'll go. I don't like comparing the struggles or the race shifting narratives between the three big countries. But I mean, I kind of don't understand the question a little bit. It's, are they the Métis? I'm not really like, maybe Daryl can come in. I'm not really too fluent on the Métis issue either.
Maybe if the two of you talk together. Or all of
Okay,
you.
so just to be clear, so there's a Métis Nation in Canada. So there's a nation based basically in the prairies, the Northern Plains. They're not just in Canada. So Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe in northern North Dakota has actually lots of people who are descendants of Métis from the Métis Nation, as does Rocky's Boy. The Rockies Boy tribe in Montana. So I just think it's important to think of the Métis as an actual nation of people who have maintained their relationships, their kinship relationships with Indigenous kin over the past couple centuries. That's different than using Métis to mean mixed. And that's sort of the basis of the critique in my work, where there's a whole group of people who are now claiming to be quote unquote Eastern Métis to differentiate themselves from the actual Métis Nation out west. And they're basing their identity on this long ago, ancestry that I was talking about earlier, sometimes Indigenous ancestors, sometimes not. And so I just think that if we're talking about, I don't think that there's a clear parallel between the Métis Nation and Chicanos, not at all. What Ricardo is saying is there's actually that if I understand, and Ricardo, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that Chicanos are actually using Indigenous symbols and Indigenous sort of language, I guess you could say, around decolonization. And by doing so, are actually displacing and dispossessing Indigenous peoples in the US Southwest and also in Mexico, right? So the Métis Nation is as a nation in and of itself of people. So it's a quite different situation.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analysis. I think, it's Chicano is a really like vague term too. Like what is it? Like I said before, like on my talk. So it could be within Chicanos themselves, like that term varies. And I think because some people were here prior to they migrated here into the US after the Mexican-American War, and some have stayed here before the war. So to say which one to classify them, it's kind of hard, But I think the overall, like the Mexican nationalism and Chicano nationalism are both products of race shifting. And that's where we have to tackle this, because how are we going to tackle race shifting in Mexico when, and how are we going to talk about sovereignty in Mexico and without people barging themselves into these spaces, claiming to be indigenous? And that's going to be hard. I think it's going to be a really hard conversation if that were to happen, because people are going to start pushing nationalist rhetoric, and we need indigenous peoples to stand up and push against it. And it's just, I think it's already messy now, but I can't even imagine what it would look like later. Yeah, thank you.
And we're still waiting for some other questions. Oh, here we go. Let's see. I have to kind of vet some of these questions too. Debbie asks, in his remarks, Daryl mentioned an article on Vermont groups. Can you paste the article title, journal, etc. in here so that she can read it? Thank you. So that's more of a request. Okay.
I can't because it hasn't been published yet, but I'll send it to you, Debbie.
Cool.
I'll send you the draft. Anyone else wants it, just send me a message and I'll send it to you.
There's a question in here from somebody who is not letting us know who they are, anonymous, which always causes a raised eyebrow from a moderator. But the question, okay, all right, that's been moved along. There's one that says, Laura, as a second-generation American who was raised by Sami grandparents and a great-grandmother from Lovosero, I am wondering how you feel about people in the diaspora identifying as Sami when the ancestors they are claiming are distant, some in the 1600s. I find this movement very frustrating and problematic, as well as isolating.
Yes, thank you for this point. It's interesting. It's also, of course, something that I don't know so much, and maybe I don't have such a strong opinion on, because as long as these identity claims are not connected with these legal and political claims, but I am aware that there is a growing tendency among people who have some descendant from Nordic countries to claim Sami identities. I have also understood that there are people who previously claimed Finnish or Norwegian descent and now suddenly have changed to Sami, sort of following this new flood of interest in indigeneity. So I think you can definitely see the race shifting or self-indigenization dynamics very strong in the not diaspora, but people with the ancestry from the Nordic countries, and how indigeneity and Saminess is becoming now much more interesting than Finnishness, Norwegianness, or Swedishness. So yes, I find it interesting and kind of frustrating also, but I've never stepped my foot on the North American continent, and I don't feel like I can very much talk about that. No.
All right, and let's see, there's one more here. Aragon is asking, how can we develop whistleblower protection for folks who see the frauds, but are worried that speaking out will cost them work, looking especially at museums? Thank you. Thoughts on that?
Could I address that briefly?
Mm-hmm.
In Australia, I think the museums are really problematic, and I notice in Laura's work too, I've heard Laura speak about how in Sami lands, people who get expertise in language, culture, whatever, cross a line, and that's a similar thing in Australia. But in Australia, there's no protection, because the identity fraudsters really are in their own little posses, and they they support each other. And I know of Aboriginal people who kind of labour, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who labour in very, very difficult circumstances. For example, in the public service in Canberra, Aboriginal people talk about the 9 to 5 blacks. That is the people who are Aboriginal in the workplace and they go back to their settler lifestyle afterwards. And but these people also are helicoptered in to high positions, whereby local Aboriginal people working in the area, and this is in cultural heritage too, I might say, they're told, oh, well, one day you will be able to apply for that job. Like you're not quite up to it. And next thing you know, there's a person helicoptered in above them who they are then expected to share their cultural knowledge with. It's extraordinary, and it's so debilitating and genocidal. But Aboriginal people can't speak up. In fact, I know what they're doing is they're getting out. They're getting out. They're finding something else, somewhere else to work. I'll just leave it there.
Does anybody else? Ricardo has his hand up.
I
ahead,
actually
Laura.
had this comment. Do you have, Ricardo, you had a hand up for a long time, so is it for something else?
It's for something else, but I can wait.
Okay, can I just say quickly, I think this kind of conference is really important precisely because we don't feel so alone. And I have to say that in Finland, when this thing started to be a really big problem, it was very difficult to talk about the problem because we also didn't have the concepts. You have to sort of find out how to talk about this issue without being understood as wanting to just exclude, being a xenophobic or whatever, and or racist. And I think it has been such a huge thing for us to actually find these discussions in North America, because it sort of is empowering to realize that these similar things are happening elsewhere and people are discussing it. And I assume that it's the same for others. And somebody commented in the chat that that people need to support each other, and I think that's very true. And having this kind of platforms for broad discussion is also a form of supporting people who work with this issue.
And Ricardo, are you going to wait on your comment? Or would you
Yeah,
like...
my comment is not about this question. I want to ask, can we answer the anonymous attendee comment?
We're gonna. Oh, we're
Yeah.
gonna.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just one moment. Okay, I've got one from Taylor.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Taylor's question is, thank you, Victoria, for your talk and your use of Agamben's Homo Sacer in the context of colonization and race shifting. I'm wondering what you think about agency within the state of exception, because I'm having a hard time scrolling. In this state is severed from political life and therefore has no agency. But if we look at who most often incites revolution, Homo Sacer tends to be the one. So I was curious if you could say more about, and the scrolling is horrible here. Sorry, I keep losing it. Could you say more about your perception of agency and the state of exception in relation to this issue? I'm also happy to read it myself if that's easier. Should I read it again, or does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I've got the gist of it. I don't want to take up a lot of time. This is a common thing that's said about Agamben's idea of the state of exception. And I think my answer to it is that people who have been successful revolutionaries have not come out of a state of exception. Not at all. The people in a state of exception are what Agamben calls, they have bare life. And I've been in some of these contexts. And this, bare life is like not knowing what clothes there are for you to put on the next day when you wake up, not knowing where you'll sleep, not knowing where your next meal's coming from, having to protect yourself from marauding relations who will steal your food, and deal with those sorts of issues. It's not having the space to be anything but surviving. And that's like, if you think about people living from day to day, then, you know, in the state of exception, it's almost from hour to hour. And you know, Agamben saw this in camps, the refugees following World War I. And this is arguably like the beginning of a huge breakdown in human ecology on the earth, right? Where people in camps invariably die. People go to camps to die. In my own country, there were 6 camps around what became the major town. And nobody knows the death rate in those camps. This was camps of people forced off their lands who like existed in a very meager way on the edge of white society. We've not looked at this closely enough, I don't think. And of course, there was a cemetery for what became, they were consolidated into one camp. Now, nobody actually knows how many people were buried there or how many people to a grave. All of the diseases, like camps have public health ramifications, right? So people forced onto what we call reserves and missions and so on, and it happened all over the Indigenous world because they took our land. And so we weren't able to get food the way we normally got food. I'll tell you, the story of colonization in Australia is the story of starvation and disease, as well as the, you know, atrocities. So people who are in that kind of existence that Agamben describes, that I can recognise being a historian of Aboriginal Australia, but you don't have to be a historian. You know, it's the camps now in the remote communities where people say, why don't they pick up their rubbish? That makes me so angry. They don't have anywhere to put the rubbish, right? These people are living on country. They don't have the systems that, you know, you have in the cities. White middle-class values do not apply when you're existing hour to hour and you don't know where your next meal's coming from. So, I mean, I could go on, but I won't. I won't. I'll leave you with that. You know, revolution, if you're talking about revolution, different parts of the world, by very definition, people have had to be empowered to do that. And people in a state of exception are not empowered, and they are actually disappearing before your eyes.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you. And we have a question here that we were looking at a minute ago. I'm going to go ahead and ask it. It's from an anonymous person here who says, I struggle with this discussion. I wonder who has the authority to define someone else's indigeneity. I think we talk about not playing into the colonial constructs, but then we have discussions on who is and who is not Indigenous. This is a big issue for all Indigenous people, and I wonder what the panelists think. And I would say, indeed, it is a big issue for Indigenous people, and people who are not Indigenous, which is the whole crux of this conversation, have no voice in that. So I'm going to leave the question for the panelists. You should be able to see, well, can you see the answered questions on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, so it's that question. Have at it.
Yeah, I would like to answer it. I would like to go at it. So the people who has the right to say who is and who's not Indigenous, Native communities do. It's very simple. We have to talk about sovereignty. It's just like any country, you know, who says who isn't or is or is not French citizen, the French government. It goes to any country. This example can go anywhere. And I think this is where people don't understand sovereignty or the legal aspects of it, and people have to educate themselves. I think it's a little weird that, we have, so this topic, I think that that's the phrase that comes up a lot is, I think I saw it in the chat somewhere, is gatekeeper. And that actually, people were using that on me. They were like, oh, you're a gatekeeper, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, I am. I'm the keeper of my sovereignty. I'm not gonna let anybody trample over it, And I think, our sovereignty is not perfect, but at the same time, it's up to people within the community to see or to change who, decide who is indigenous. For example, blood quantum, Comanches is 1/8. It's up to us and only us to decide who is in Comanche. And I think, not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees, but the point is, like I said again, we decide on that. So thank you.
Would anyone else like to answer that question? Please, Victoria.
I just want to say, I think that's one of the first things that was laid down by Indigenous people when they got to the United Nations, was that Indigenous people themselves have the right to say who belongs to their group. So, I mean, you could say, well, you've got to be able to define the original Indigenous person and to do that. But seriously, we know who we are. And we know, it's surprising. You'd think the way things go in Australia, a lot of Aboriginal people say nothing about the race shifters or the identity frauds, but in the interviews that I'm doing, it's clear. People know who is not Aboriginal. People know who is, and part of that is the protocol that we have where you establish connections. I said to one young woman recently who says that she may not have earned the right to identify as Aboriginal, but she is, however, doing it because she believes she has an ancestor. This is a great-great-grandmother. And I said, darling, just tell me who your family is and where you're from. And chances are I might know some of your aunties. But, it's as simple as that. But she couldn't answer me. She accused me of violence. And next thing you know, she'll be an Aboriginal expert on something. And we have to swallow this.
Indeed. And if they were really Indigenous, they would know that that's the very first thing Indigenous people ask somebody. An American Indian person who meets another person claiming to be American Indian, it's the very first thing they're going to do is ask, who is your family and where are you from? It's not rude, it's our culture.
Exactly.
Right? The Cherokee scholars on sovereignty and identity said, when you state that you are an American Indian or any other type of Indigenous person, you have just invited conversation into your genealogy, into your ancestry. I forget the exact wording, but that's basically it. Laura, you have your hand up, and Ricardo, you still have your hand up. Did you just forget to take it down, or?
No, I want to make a comment too about sovereignty, if that's okay.
So let's do that real quick, and then Laura.
Yeah, so I think we have to be really careful about race shifters chipping away at our sovereignty. They want to define indigeneity on their terms. So we have to, that's why I'm very strict about not letting people talk negatively about our sovereignty or saying it's colonial or whatever these, like I said, these terms are being made up. We have to, get them and break them apart and see where it's coming from, if it's genuine or if it's race shifting. And, and that's I think gatekeeping is a race shifting term, Thank you.
Laura.
Yes, I wanted to just address this one problem, because I absolutely agree that it's the communities which decide and so, but for example, in Finland, we have a situation in which the Sami parliament, which of course is not the perfect institution to represent the Sami because it's not based on the model of a Sami community organization. It's a kind of a state institute in a sense, but however, it's the one that represents the Sami and within which also decisions regarding the electoral register are made. And now we have a situation in which the Finnish state or the Supreme Administrative Court has actually sort of changed the electoral register. So you have more and more people included and even as standing in the elections who the Sami don't consider as Sami. And for this reason, for example, there's been wide discussion of boycotting Sami parliament, of leaving the Sami parliament, of leaving it to the Finns then. Like what do you do with an institution which is already getting so compromised? And the problem is also that because this problem or this whole discussion has been dragging on for a long time. And, you know, there are Sami who are actively defending the Sami right for self-determination, but there's also many Sami who are not active, who don't follow things and who don't care so much. And many people start feeling tired of this whole discussion and debate and the kind of we call it opposition bloc, or those people who are now in the Sami parliament who are sort of driving this self-indigenization agenda. So they have actually adopted discourse of collaboration, peace, harmony. So they are now within the Sami parliament, and their discourses that we need to collaborate, we need to stop arguing about who is Sami. So this kind of discussion is now within the Sami parliament. And so of course the fear is that over time, this institution is not representing the Sami anymore, and how then you define who is Sami by the community. So like this whole situation represents a fundamental crisis of Sami self-determination in Finland as it was laid out in the Act on Sami Parliament and when the Sami cultural autonomy was established. So maybe some other form of organizing needs to be invented if this issue is not resolved in some other way. So it's a serious problem, really.
It really is at the crux of everything. So I'm glad we addressed it. There is a question here from Daniel. For Victoria, can you suggest literature and research which looks at the imitation and appropriation of Aboriginal identity?
Daniel, there's not a great deal. I did mention it in an article that I wrote for Sami. Laura reminded me recently, or she told me she'd read it. I was really gratified. That about 2007, it was about authenticity. And so I think that is the first time it was raised in any like academic literature. And I also questioned a historian in Australia who, you know, the scholars are really problematic. When I visited the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, I was really like shocked to find that the people there actually thought that he was Aboriginal. Now, whether he said that or not, I don't know. But it was really disappointing to me that there was no real Aboriginal advice given to the Royal Commission. And but then I reviewed a book in which he like strongly suggested that he was of Aboriginal descent. And so I kind of critically analysed that. And I think as a result of that, I've been locked out of the Institution of History in Australia. Really, I can't get a job as a historian in Australia, and I'm a prominent Aboriginal historian. There are only about 4 of us. And I'm not going to worry about it, though. I'm happy to be where the ancestors have put me. I think there's a reason for, you know, what happens and where I am. And so I was asked by Gaynor MacDonald, who is an anthropologist, a non-Aboriginal anthropologist who's worked for something like 3 decades with Wiradjuri people in the southeast of Australia to come onto a panel last year. And I was actually quite loath to do it because I thought this whole identity crisis is going to overtake my life. And I've got other academic research I'd like to do. And, I was kind of dragged kicking and screaming. Now that I've found out about the wonderful support that we've got in Finland, Canada, and the USA, and I'm very happy to be here. So it was fortuitous. But Gaynor is published in this area, I think, or she's about to. And then there are colleagues I have, Aboriginal colleague Suzanne Ingram from the University of Sydney, Kathleen Butler-McElwraith from the University of Newcastle, and Paul Irish, who is an independent historical consultant working with Aboriginal people at La Perouse in Sydney, who are all contributing chapters to the book that Gordon, Daryl, Laura, and I are editing. So it's going to be a very new thing for Australia. And as was said in my bio, I'm very keen just to have this area of human activity as an okay area to research. It's a human phenomenon, it's happening. We should be able to research and discuss it. And at the moment, you are absolutely cancelled out in Australia when you do that. And the curious thing in Australia is that it's very much the left that's supporting the race shifters. And I mean, people that I've known throughout my career, who I think actually should know better, a man I know who was married to one of my best friends back in the 80s, and he certainly knows what an Aboriginal person is, but he came out in great defence of Bruce Pascoe. There's another question there for me that includes something about him. That's, the rise of Bruce Pascoe, if you like, as an Aboriginal person, this kind of conjuring trick he did, has broken open the discussion in Australia. So Suzanne and I were both published in the Australian newspaper. And then people said, oh, but of course it's Rupert Murdoch and blah, blah, blah. I tell you what, the Socialist Left Review would not have published us. So I'm just going to go with people who will publish, frankly. And I actually also was able to publish a book review of the book by the anthropologist Peter Sutton and the archaeologist Karen Welsh that debunks the whole thesis, if you like, of Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu. I was able to publish that in the Australian. So, things are like moving along. And I think the academic book that's been co-published across Australia, Canada, and the United States is going to, perhaps produce some interesting results. I would like to see this as something that's taught in Indigenous studies. Frankly, I think it's a very important, the whole question of who is an Aboriginal person and what does that mean is extraordinarily important. And it goes, to the centre of why we're here and what is our task here. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just want to pitch one thing. So one thing that you can see is happening here is that some of us have been creating networks across spaces that might not be seen as connected otherwise. And it's been really, really useful because I think it just kind of like expands our understanding of what's happening and really provides all kinds of different ways to think about it and to act to kind of stop this movement, if you will, this movement of whether we call it race shifting, self-indigenization, whatever it is. we call it. And, I think one thing that a few of my colleagues and I have been somewhat excited about thinking through is to set up some sort of, more formal organization, whether it's academic or it's academic and has community connections. Because once you start doing this type of work, what happens is you find out that there's a lot of interest, but also demand, because this movement is really harming Indigenous peoples in all kinds of different ways. And I'm not just talking discursive ways, ways in terms of how people are talked about or how people experience this in relation to others, but it's really like in very material ways, right? So I think that just in terms of, I'm not saying anything in particular about what that might look like, but it might be interesting to think about how we could sort of organize something that can really share resources. I know that Laura, Vicky, Ricardo, Gordon, other people who I've had conversations with, we're always trying to share material and kind of get a better understanding what's happening in local contexts and kind of make sense of what that means for our own research. And I think if we could have some sort of an institute where people actually get paid, I'm not talking about myself as an academic, but people who can sort of organize a lot of this material, I think we'd be much, much better for it, particularly as this sort of research area becomes more and more, just more and more people sort of start exploring it. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that I'm open to having those types of conversations.
Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I truly think that this is, it's such an important question, but it's actually research-wise also extremely interesting. And I think it's very much about the nature or character of contemporary colonialism, and like looking at these changes in the relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples, and how this reflects some interesting changes in that relationship, and how we can understand this phenomenon as a kind of a reflection or kind of how it articulates contemporary colonial problematics. So I do consider this field of study as actually as if it wasn't a bit depressing, it would be just also very fascinating. And I think there's so much work to be done, because these issues with identity, they open up to so many different directions that I really consider it very necessary and fruitful to start to consider this as a field of study, like a serious one. and so I wanted to catch up on that, following what Daryl was just saying, that I think this should be ambitiously developed, because this is a phenomenon that opens to so many directions. And of course, having these connections to other settler colonial locations makes us all much stronger in our own thinking, in our own analysis, and in also withstanding the pressure that we might face when we try to examine this issue.
All right, and we have a couple of really good questions still here too. To Victoria and the panel, I've experienced the kind of shutting down you described, Victoria, when questioning the Indigenous credentials of Bruce Pascoe, a high-profile, successful Australian author. Could you and the panel comment on the philosophical commitment to the truth that you learned from your culture and why that matters? Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm actually glad for that question, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about the important ethics and values of Indigenous people that, in my experience, are always forefront. The way that I was raised, you'd never lied. You just never lied. And in fact, in Aboriginal Australia, I had a friend from university who was a lawyer, went up to the Northern Territory to work with the Aboriginal Legal Service. And he said, these Aboriginal boys who walk into a store and pick up a packet of pens or something, they can't lie. So somebody says to them, where'd you get those from? They say, I just got it from the store over there. And, you know, they're charged and so on. But it's a very, very important principle that I think should be a lot more widespread. So now in Australia, we've got truth telling happening. It's kind of, you know, a fashion. And I wonder, when they take testimony from Aboriginal people, are they going to be actually checking that these people are in fact Aboriginal? Or will it be liars who are telling the truth about things Aboriginal? It's very, very chaotic, and it's very ill-defined. And a lot of it is because people are not brave enough, it seems, to actually tackle the question, to ask the question, who are you? So, I mean, when I talk about remembering, I've been thinking about Akim Mbembe's idea of remembering. He is now talking about the collapse of Earth systems and so on, and that there will be a need for people to remember things to do with a living Earth. What's going to be really important in all of that is the values and ethics of Aboriginal people. This is the intangible cultural values that we have and that we promote and promulgate. And truth, you're not going to get very far when the chips are down if you can't be honest about what's going on. There's so much dishonesty at the moment about what's going on with the earth and the way it's been abused and mistreated. In fact, you could say that, you know, all of the lies and chicanery that accompanied colonization have kind of become the way people want to behave. I know, because I did spend a little time with, I had the opportunity to spend a little time with Native people in Canada. You know, like Aboriginal people in Australia, a lot of them just stand back and look askance at what goes on. But at the same time, quite powerless to change anything. But, you know, everything changes. So it's so important that we hold on to these values and that, in fact, we fight for them. It's important to fight for the truth. I mean, when I was a kid, I got a hard slap if someone caught me out on a lie. That only had to happen once, that I recall, frankly. I thought I'd try it because I didn't want to get into trouble, you know, so just tried it and got a hard slap. But, you know, so, but what I'm saying is the truth is so important and we need to fight for it. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to comment? Okay, going on to the next question. Thank you very much, Victoria. All of these have been so powerful. So many Mexican artists that are self-identifying as Southern California state tribes. How do we hold museums, universities, etc., accountable that host them, video them, even when they are shown their true genealogy, and continue on?
I think maybe expanding the Indian Arts and Craft Act. I think that's already a thing in the US. Like you can't display native art if you can't say it's native art unless it's from like a federally recognized tribal member. But I think, you know, I think that's where like Chicanos or Mexicans get away with it because there's the lack of sovereignty in Mexico. So they, you know, claim they're indigenous from Mexico, or they'll claim they're indigenous from a state recognized tribe. And that's part of the adoption fantasies as well within decolonization. It's not a metaphor by Tucking Yang. So I think there's so many aspects to this. I think it's not just Mexican artists. I think it's race shifting artists in general. You know, they use different tactics. of claiming indigeneity and trying to find a loophole to the Indians Arts and Craft Act. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I found in my exploration of the fake tribes in Vermont is that once a group is recognized by a state, so it's not just federal, then they actually qualify under the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. So all of these white people in Vermont are allowed going around saying that they're Native American and sell what they claim is authentic Native American artwork when in fact it's not at all.
I think we have to be careful too about what the state recognized, because there's like, that's a whole different conversation. Some people don't agree that, with the process of state recognition, and legally, it's a really hard topic, but like I said, that's a loophole.
And could I just comment on what Celeste wrote? Celeste
Yes, please.
Henry Spade, about being defined every day as an Ojibwe person by the way people treat her and call her and so on. It's a living relationship within a family and a kinship system. And it reminds me of what Kim Tallbear was talking about in her paper. And I'm a little overloaded. I might not remember this well, but I'm open to being corrected. But I think Kim was saying that identity is not a good word for us. That identity is actually like a settler colonial idea, and that we are more like actively related, or that she used another word. She put up a couple of other words as options, I think, and I thought that was particularly valuable work, particularly valuable ideas that she had there. I'm revisiting it. Yes, we're all within the settler colonial construct they've made for us most of the time. And the really important thing is to kind of think our way out of it and then act our way out of it. There's another really important Aboriginal value is movement, not remaining static. And I think that's an Indigenous thing too. You're relating to the earth by moving over it. But movement is a way of solving problems and all sorts of things.
Thank you. And I want to ask Gordon, how much longer would you like to go? Because we're out of questions, but we probably could have some lively discussion among the panelists. What would you like to do, Gordon?
Well, I will defer to the panelists, of course, but we're running up to 2 hours, and I don't want to take people's time up too much. I mean, I know we can talk about these subjects for a long time, and I hope we do. I hope we continue to pick up on these subjects. And please, anyone who's viewing or talking today, reach out to me, or I would imagine the panelists as well, if you want to continue this conversation or have ideas about how we can advance different organizational ideas, conferences, publications, video, educational materials, whatever we can do to deal with this, please reach out, and we're working on it. But I'll leave it up to the panelists. I mean, you want to take a few more questions, or are you guys pretty much at the end of the line here? Because I think we can maybe get one or two questions in. I know Daryl's got a little one at home.
I can do one or two questions, sure.
Okay.
So if anyone would like to put one or two questions in the Q&A section, that would be terrific. Ricardo is suggesting maybe some closing remarks in lieu of questions. People are commenting on the problem with the term indigenous. But I don't see any questions just yet, giving people a minute to think about it.
I don't think panelists can post questions in there.
I don't think that we can.
No.
So if panelists have questions for each other,
Hmm.
you can just holler them out.
Or you could put them in chat if you wanted to the
Mhm.
other panelists.
Mm-hmm. We can chat with each other in the chat, yeah.
Someone in chat said they do have a question.
Oh, Lynn, and it's Lynn.
Lynn,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lynn. You can put it either place and I'll see it. We can all see it.
Raven also suggested that it would be good at a future type event if we could have some conversation with the people who are attending, because I think people will just bring some really great ideas. Obviously, I think it's tricky because then we've all faced very hostile people who are angry with us because of our research. So this is why I think sometimes these events tend to have a bit more of a moderated, sort of question and answer, unfortunately. But I really like that idea, Raven.
So,
Yeah, if you're okay
Lynn-
with putting Lynn on,
yeah, can we mic Lynn Taylor?
yeah.
Just
Oh.
did.
Quake, hi, can you hear me?
Hey, Lynn.
Yeah.
Hi. So, I did my master's in identity and I'm an Algonquin from living in Canada where we have a real issue with pretend Indians. And I had a charter challenge regarding my own identity issues in Canada, which took me 30 years. So I had a lot of time to think about identity. And I come from the perspective of from cultural anthropology and Indigenous studies. And I thought, I've been thinking a lot about issues with pretend Indians, of course. And I'm thinking one of the issues, and maybe people can just offer some commentary, and I'm certainly not trying to make excuses for pretend Indians. I think one of the issues is that state nationalism is so inadequate, so adequate, yet at the same time so inadequate. It's very adequate at removing people's ethnic cultural identity from their lives, from their consciousness, from their hearts. State nationalist identity is so very shallow. I mean, a flag and a song can only take you so far. And indigenous cultures, their identities are in things like their feast food and their language and their songs and their dances and their rituals, their ceremonies. It's very depthful. And so I think that's what I think is happening with a lot of settler people is they have a big identity void. And through that big identity void, the DSM should come up with a category for them. They are appropriating Indigenous identities and causing us real harm because they don't have the sense to go back to their own Indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me say all that. If anybody has any comments, that would be great.
Thanks, Lynn. So I think that Lynn's definitely onto something. I mean, one of the things that I learned and thought a lot about in reading Circe Sturm's book, Becoming Indians, is when she talks specifically about this sort of like white identity crisis that sort of evolves, particularly in the post-civil rights era, where white people want to sort of get away from any responsibility or accountability in sort of the histories of racism. And so what happens is you see white people sort of start shifting their identities away from sort of being seen and are thought of as white. You see that those who are the descendants of the more recent immigrants, say in the US context, the late 1800s, Irish, Polish, Greek, Scandinavian, etc. They start imagining themselves and claiming white ethnic minority identities, so that there's these new associations that sort of form. And that's their way of saying, well, actually, we're not quite white. We're a bit different. My ancestors 150 years ago were not seen as white, therefore I shouldn't be today. Italian Americans as well. So that's one part of that movement. The flip side is for those Americans, those white Americans who have a longer history in the Americas, they start to indigenize themselves. And so in both cases, you see that this sort of way in which white people are being challenged head on in a way that had never happened quite to that extent and sort of on that level, particularly by African-American, but also Indigenous Americans through a variety of different social movements, start to say, well, we don't want to be white anymore. We want to be something else. A corollary to that is, of course, the whole white victimhood narrative that we see sort of comes to fruition with Trump becoming president. But there are these ways in which I think the escape from whiteness is definitely part of the story here. And so demographers in the US who have studied this, Circe Sturm, actually, I'll link to the story. She just did a little analysis for the conversation. In the US now, there's 9.7 million people in the last census who say that they're Native American. And this has exploded over really the past 50 years, since 1970, when there's a big shift in the census. Prior to that, the Native American population for over 100 years stayed relatively stable and increased at a rate much lower than the American population. From 1970 onwards, it has increased at a rate of 10 times the American population. It's incredible, right? This is a huge social phenomenon. I just wanted to talk a bit about demographics there, but I'll link to that story.
And we've got a question too from Victoria herself to Ricardo that says, and if you'd like to ask it yourself, Victoria, that's fine, about the dispossession of Chicano people.
Right. It took me a while to catch up with the history of Texas and other parts, Ricardo, and I don't know a great deal, but it seems to me that there was a huge amount of dispossession of people who were part of the Mexican state in the southeast of what is now the USA. And I'm wondering what you think about that. I mean, are they actually owed anything now because of their dispossession? Brutal, violent dispossession. It was a recolonizing force, if you like. If they are they owed anything, and if they are, who owes it to them? Think of the context of truth telling and reparations.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're owed nothing, right? And the reason I say that is because people can look up the history of the Mexican Comanche War, which is my people, and the Mexican Apache War, and you have the colonization of the Pueblos in New Mexico, and the Navajos in Arizona. So they were colonizing. So one colonizer took land from another colonizer. They owe nothing to me. From my point of view, they're owed nothing. And now they claim to be they claim to be indigenous because the U.S. is colonizing them. That's just it's like they're still colonizers. So I think it's really hard conversation, but I feel because I'm also Mexican. I was born in Mexico, and there has been prejudice against Mexicans from the American settler states because it runs differently. It's more Anglo-centered, the white man, the rich white man, compared to what Mexican colonization was, where there was more mixing. And I think, I don't think, the conversation should be, how do we give total sovereignty to Native people of this continent, and how do we abolish settler colonization? So, and I think Chicanismo and Mexican nationalism is part of settler colonization, and we have to abolish them. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting to me. You and I will talk about this some more.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
There is another question in the chat. Race shifting by term indigenous affects American Indian culture that affects education, laws that exploit to gain educational funds. The most damaging concern is the American Indian social structure, which deals with traditions and cultures that has and will create a new belief system defining who the American Indian people are in today's society. And one of the things that's been striking me is our erasure by this, people erasing us by replacing us. Any thoughts on that?
Could
I
I,
think, oh, go ahead, sorry.
you go ahead, Ricardo.
I think this is happening within Chicanos. They're redefining what culture is, and they're pan-indigenizing our culture. You know, like the example I brought up with the museum. You know, they obviously broke laws, and you know, and they obviously have a pan. You know, like they don't know. So one Native community will have a different guidelines to what is sacred and what's not, what type of bird, whatever. And you know, people that come into this culture and the race shifters, they'll think all eagle feathers, all types of birds are sacred, and they don't understand how each community has their own, you know, protocol. So they create this pan-indigenous culture that's just made up, you know, and then they call it decolonizing by teaching other people. When that's not decolonizing, that's just race shifting. So yeah, thank you.
I just want to pick up just on the little something happening in the chat. David, who was just saying bye, he's organizing that event in Vermont and is coming under an incredible amount of pressure to cancel it by the Pretendians there, who are state recognized. So if you do have a chance, I linked in the chat earlier to the event if you're able to go. I think they have over 600 people who've signed up already, which is really great. And I want to point out, because this is just, people were talking in that thread about some of the threats that they get. There's someone who is actually suing me for defamation who is here today. And I kind of see it as a form of stalking at this point. But yeah, she's been here the whole time and has been coming to all my events. So this is a common behavior on the part of Pretendians. In terms of the type of hostility and aggressivity that they express, particularly to those of us who do this type of research. So yeah, I just kind of want to flag that. You kind of get used to it, but it's still a bit unnerving at times.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very important conversation. I think that itself should be a panel, should have been a panel of the threats that Native people get and the harassments from covering about race shifting. You know, I've dealt with people posting pictures of my face, my address, death threats, people talking about my kids, pictures of my kids on the internet. I mean, I don't know how these people get it, and I have really strict about who's on my social media now because of that. So it's really bad, because I'm very hesitant now to work with anybody that just comes up to me, you know, with emails. And now I have to make sure I don't find out who they are and their stances on stuff. We have to do extra work now, you know, than just trusting anybody. But you know, it's a little bit traumatic, you know. But it goes from natives and non-natives, because people give me, they tell me like, I will give Daryl as an example. Oh, Daryl's not native. How can he talk about this? And I tell people, well, Daryl's talking about this as a French Canadian, viewing this as through his own lens. It's still legitimate, I think, because now he's talking about his own people, race shifting. We should have allies in this space. You know, we shouldn't just have only Native people talking about this. So, and that's my perspective on that. Thank you.
Could I just throw something else into the mix? And that is that I'm not very articulate about this point, but I've become aware of some theoretical work that's done, and I'm thinking of Michel Serres, a French philosopher who is actually speaks a version of French that is very old. We're talking about Europeans getting back to their own indigenous roots. He might be a good example, but a lot of his work, because he only speaks and writes in that language, a lot of his work has not been translated. He's a contemporary of Foucault, but some of his work that has become accessible to me is fascinating. He says, for example, there's a quote, "I'm a scientist, but I have a fault. And that is that I believe that there are mysteries of the natural world that I will never be able to understand." And I think this is the thing about Indigenous people, being in touch with those mysteries, and perhaps not in direct ways like you might have in a scientific treatise or whatever, but being in touch with it. And one of the things that go along with this thinking is that we as human beings are actually also a part of the natural world, and we've lost sight of that. And the thing is that people en masse are moved by forces that they don't even really understand. So, you know, you've had the experience, and most of us have, of being at a rock concert or something where you kind of moved along with the fervor, or, you know, and we know about the way people have behaved in rallies and different things like that. I mean, that's extreme examples, but a lot of people don't know why they behaved in certain ways after the fact. And this perhaps it could be applied to the pretendians. What are they after, really? I mean, we talk about the dollars, and we know the dollars are there, but it's huge, isn't it? I mean, there's something else going on. I think there's something else going on. I can't quite grasp it, but maybe I never will. But it is a phenomenon of immense proportions, and it is also unthinkingly genocidal of us. So, you know, I'm just not sure how I can articulate that any further, but
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, when you talk about the violence that's invested, I've actually avoided quite a bit of it. I'm living in the United States. I've said more than once, I'm blessed really to be here, because things were getting to be really insufferable for me. And they were insufferable because I saw these people being promoted. And I was actually told by, you know, university executives, in a way, the way they were talking and everything was that, you know, that was a better alternative. So, you know, here am I, an experienced dyed-in-the-wool Aboriginal educationalist who set up 3 different programs at Australian universities for Aboriginal people to come in, and who actually developed the first curriculum in Indigenous studies in Australia at Tranby Aboriginal College in Sydney, and who worked on the National Aboriginal Education Policy, and who, I'm going to go on and on and on. I'm not actually what they're looking for. And I'm looking at what they're looking for is a younger person, that was it. But they're also looking for the person who is not so Aboriginal as I am, because I'm like, you know, a person who will say, well, if you do that, that's actually not going to work. We're not going to get the outcomes we're looking for. I'm the person to say that after, you know, 30 years of experience, but they don't want it. So what have they got now in Australian universities? They've got Indigenous studies that is in a parlous state. For example, all of the big issues in Australia at the moment, like truth-telling and blah, blah, there's not one of these people actually involved in it. Oh, what they're doing, navel gazing. There's, you know, you've got Indigenous academics who are actually not progressing our aims. They're not progressing our aims. And maybe this is what the Australian state wants. It's what they're allowing. And so, you know, there's a kind of a, you know, this is probably to do with the whole I mean, is this a stretch? I think it's something to do with the death of the living earth. Because we, as Aboriginal and other Indigenous people in the world, are arguably the defenders. And we are also the barometer of what's going on. You know, the casualties in Aboriginal Australia are increasing. There's more police violence, there's more deaths, there's more, and tell you what else, there's more Aboriginal suicide. And I know this is a thing in Native communities in the US and Canada as well. And there was a wonderful young man who was involved in the pipeline defense, who passed away recently, and I don't know, but he was very young to die of natural causes. You know, this is such an important issue. It just goes to the heart of everything. The identity question.
Ricardo,
There's a question
ahead.
here, yeah. So there's a question here, and it says, it appears to me that many Mexican Americans, Mexican Central Americans have significant indigenous ancestry. Many of them are also land-based farmers with rich cultural practices that are indigenous oriented, like the Mexican American communities that live near Sangre de Cristo Mountains in New Mexico, that claim political rights that stem from them being heirs of large Spanish land grants and are still held as communal property rights. There is political character to their community in the long term, and how do we deal with the presence of large communities that have no official status as indigenous peoples, or culturally and even political devoted to indigenous land ethics and spirituality. So, you know, there were the native people that were in Mexico at that time, then that's not Mexico anymore, that's part of the US. They went through American colonization different from the Mexican settlers. They were treated as settlers, and that was in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty itself separates indigenous peoples from Mexicans. It's clearly in that treaty, right? So native people got obviously treated different from within the US. And now we have, you know, people say that Mexicans have indigenous ancestry. Maybe they do, but are they part of a native community now in Mexico? Are they helping these communities in Mexico? You know, I mean, these people, some of these people have lived as settlers for so long. You know, at what point do we say they're still indigenous or they're not indigenous if they're helping settler colonization in the Americas? You know, to me, it's just, you know, it's like taking a DNA test and having come back as indigenous. Yeah, you might have indigenous ancestry, or you know, but you've lived as a colonizer. You know, so to me, you know, these people, you know, that where were they when the native people were being colonized? You know, were they helping native people, or they're hiding out, living as settlers? You know, and it's very easy to just say, you know, Mexicans are indigenous because they're brown, and even that's a fallacy, I think, because you know there was indigenous peoples from the Philippines being shipped into Mexico, a pretty good number of Black people from the slave trade. There's as many Black people brought into the U.S. and into Mexico, even more South America from the slave trade. So that itself shows you, right? And then, you know, like even what is a Spaniard? Like to me, they're not whites, because they have had 800 years of Arab history. Right at the moment that they came to Mexico, that's when the Reconquista ended. You know, 800 years of Arab, Jewish, Berber, Romani history in Mexico, you know, in Spain. So, you know, the thought that Spanish are just whites is as another fallacy, you know. So, you know, to say somebody's indigenous because they're brown in Mexico is ignoring all these histories, and it's promoting indigenismo. And to me, it's disgusting that anybody would promote these ideas. And it's kind of like people want to be, you know, with the age of the internet, let me go back a little bit, you know, the masses are saying what is right and what is wrong for politics. Some people lean towards the right, or leans toward the left, or however the demographics you want to consider it. But I think there's a lot of talk about decolonization and, for indigenous peoples within within the left. And some people, that don't know history pick up on these things. They pick up on these politics, and they say, hey, I might be indigenous because I'm brown, without knowing all this history. So they will defend indigenismo. I'm seeing it online a lot. I've seen people defending indigenismo like it's a decolonial movement, when it's not. It's a settler movement. So I think if anybody defends indigenismo, and it shows you that they're settler. They don't know anything about indigenous peoples, because Native people themselves in Mexico talking about this. You just look up Lourdes Alberto. She's a Zapotec scholar. She wrote that article about indigenismo, and in the damages it's done. So, some people might have indigenous ancestry, but what is their, relation to settler colonization? We have to think about that. And I think that's being overlooked, when it comes to, the colonization of Mexico by Mexico, So thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. I need to run. It's also getting very, very late for Laura in Finland.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it's, if you don't mind, we'd like to close this session, and with that, close the conference as well. Taylor has posted a link to a website for future information, and I want to thank our pilots today for excellent work, and your courage and your strength, and also just your intelligence and the way you're going about things. I really do appreciate you all, and all of you who've participated as attendees too is really encouraging in many ways. So thank you all. We're going to close up now, and wish you all the best.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.